This video introduces the two-state model of drug-receptor interactions and shows how it explains partial and inverse agonism. It extends the receptor occupancy model explained in my previous video. The receptor occupancy model explains binding, but binding alone can't explain these curves. So far, we've been talking as if receptors are either off or on only when a drug binds. The two-state model starts by questioning that assumption. According to this model, receptors are not static. Even in the absence of any ligand, a receptor can adopt more than one conformation. At its simplest, we can think of two states: an inactive state, often called R, and an active state called R star. Crucially, receptors can enter the active state spontaneously. That means a system can show activity even with no drug present. Drugs don't create these states, they change how often the receptor occupies them. The two-state model can explain why different receptors show different levels of basal activity. The balance between inactive and active states depends on how fast receptors move in each direction. The forward transition from R to R star is governed by the rate constant k+1, and the reverse transition from R star back to R is governed by k-1. When these two rate constants are similar, there is no strong bias toward either state. But in some receptors, k+1 is high relative to k-1. The active state is formed faster than it recovers to the inactive state. As a result, receptors spend more time in the active state. Even without any drug present, this produces measurable basal activity. In other receptors, k-1 is greater than k+1. So the backward rate dominates. Active states are rare and basal activity may be minimal or absent. So basal activity is not a universal property. It emerges from the intrinsic kinetics of the receptor. Drugs don't create these equilibria, they act on equilibria that already exist. We'll start again with the basic two-state equilibrium. Receptors spontaneously interconvert between the inactive state R and the active state R star. Now we introduce ligand A. A full agonist binds preferentially to the active state R star. By stabilizing R star, it pulls the equilibrium of the reaction strongly towards activity. An inverse agonist does the opposite. Ligand I preferentially binds the inactive state. This shifts the equilibrium toward R, reducing activity below baseline. Not all ligands favour one state over the other. An antagonist B binds the receptor with similar affinity for both states. It occupies receptors, but does not shift the equilibrium. Ligand P is a partial agonist and falls between these extremes. It binds both states, but has a higher affinity for the active state. As a result, the equilibrium shifts towards activity, but only partially. In the two-state model, ligand efficacy reflects how strongly binding stabilizes one receptor's state relative to the other. The pharmacology looks different, but the principle is the same. We can now bring these ideas together. The same two-state equilibrium is present throughout. What changes is how different ligands bias it. We'll start with an antagonist. Antagonists bind the receptor but do not favour either state. The equilibrium between R and R star is unchanged. As a result, there is no intrinsic activity. A full agonist produces a large maximal response. At the receptor level, it strongly stabilizes the active state. The equilibrium is shifted decisively toward R star. A partial agonist reaches a lower maximum, even at high concentrations. It binds both states, but with a preference for the active state. The equilibrium shifts toward activity, but only partially. An inverse agonist reduces activity below the basal level. It preferentially stabilizes the inactive state. The equilibrium shifts in the opposite direction. These dose-response curves are macroscopic readouts of microscopic equilibrium shifts. The differences in maximal response can be summarized using a single measure: efficacy. Efficacy reflects the maximum response a ligand can produce relative to basal activity. A full agonist has high positive efficacy. A partial agonist has lower positive efficacy. An antagonist has zero efficacy, and an inverse agonist has negative efficacy. In the two-state model, efficacy reflects how strongly binding stabilizes the active state relative to the inactive state. So how are efficacy values actually assigned? Efficacy is defined relative to a reference agonist. A full agonist is the ligand that produces the largest maximal response in a given system. By convention, that response is assigned an efficacy value of 1. Partial agonists produce a smaller maximum under the same conditions. Their efficacy lies between 0 and 1. An antagonist produces no response on its own. Its efficacy is defined as 0. Inverse agonists reduce activity below basal levels. They are assigned negative efficacy values. In some systems, a ligand produces a greater maximal response than the reference full agonist. These are called superagonists. In this case, the original full agonist is no longer the reference. The scale is renormalized and the superagonist is assigned an efficacy of 1. Efficacy values are therefore not absolute properties of drugs. They depend on the system, the assay, and the reference agonist used. You now know that a full agonist strongly stabilizes the active state, shifting the equilibrium towards R star. A partial agonist also favours the active state, but less strongly. As a result, some agonist-bound receptors are in the active state, but some agonist-bound receptors are in the inactive state. Now consider what happens when a full agonist and a partial agonist are present together. The full agonist stabilizes a proportion of the receptors in the active state, but the partial agonist competes for binding. And when the partial agonist occupies receptors, some are active, but others are inactive. This reduces the total number of active receptors contributing to the response. As a result, the full agonist produces a smaller maximum response, when a partial agonist is also present. Two concepts that are often confused are potency and efficacy. Potency tells us how much drug is needed to produce an effect. It's reflected by the EC₅₀, the concentration producing 50% of the maximum effect. The EC₅₀ depends on the affinity of the drug for the receptor, and it determines where the dose-response curve sits along the x-axis. Efficacy tells us how much effect is possible. It's reflected by the Emax, the maximum effect. Emax depends on how well a ligand stabilizes the active state of the receptor, and it determines how high the curve goes. Let's see what that looks like in practice. Here we have two drugs, drug A and drug B. They have the same maximum response, so they have the same efficacy. But drug A has a lower EC₅₀ than drug B, indicating that it has a higher potency. Now look at this example. Drug A has the same EC₅₀ as before, so it remains more potent than drug B. But drug A now has a lower maximum response and therefore lower efficacy than drug B. This demonstrates that a more potent drug reaches a given effect at a lower concentration, but that does not mean it produces a greater maximum effect. Finally, although potency matters for dosing convenience and safety, a highly potent drug with low efficacy will not produce a strong clinical effect. To summarize, receptors exist in equilibrium between inactive and active states, and drugs differ in how they shift that equilibrium. Full agonists strongly stabilize the active state and produce a high maximum response, while partial agonists stabilize it less and therefore have lower efficacy. Inverse agonists stabilize the inactive state and suppress basal activity. Antagonists, in contrast, do not favor either state. Finally, potency and efficacy describe different properties of a drug. Potency tells us how much drug is needed to produce an effect, while efficacy tells us how much effect is possible. Understanding that distinction is essential for interpreting dose-response curves and drug behavior.